The courtroom was thick with tension as the 16-year-old defendant sat quietly, her hands trembling slightly on her lap. The weight of the room pressed down on her, a mixture of grim anticipation and the collective sorrow of those present. The charges she faced were severe, and the community's shock was palpable. This was a teenager, barely out of childhood, now at the center of a trial that had gripped an entire town. The judge's gavel struck with a sharp echo, signaling the start of the sentencing phase. But the emotions in the room were far from settled. As the proceedings began, the defendant's voice broke through the silence with a tearful declaration. "This is unfair." The words hung in the air, raw and desperate, revealing a young girl caught between confusion and fear. For many, her words only deepened the tragedy. How could someone so young be accused of something so terrible? Yet the evidence was mounting, and the public's demand for answers was insistent. Before we continue, make sure to like and subscribe to never miss a new video. And tell me, where are you watching this video from? I love seeing all different people come together for these stories. The victim, a beloved member of the community, was remembered in somber tones by family and friends who had gathered to witness the trial. The crime had shattered more than just one life. It had fractured a network of relationships, leaving a community reeling from the loss. The courtroom was filled with those who sought justice, their faces etched with grief and disbelief. Among them, the victim's family sat in solemn silence, their pain a poignant reminder of the human cost behind the legal proceedings. The initial shock of the charges rippled through the town. Friends and neighbors struggled to reconcile the image of a typical teenager with the severity of the accusations. Social media buzzed with speculation and outrage, while local news outlets covered every development with intense scrutiny. The trial became a crucible where grief, anger, and questions about justice collided. In the early moments of the hearing, the defense attorney rose to address the court, his tone measured but resolute. He painted a picture of a young defendant overwhelmed by circumstances beyond her control, appealing to the jury's sense of empathy. But the prosecution countered with a narrative of cold calculation, emphasizing the gravity of the crime and the irreversible damage caused. The stark contrast between the two perspectives set the stage for a trial that would delve deeply into difficult questions about culpability and morality. Witnesses took the stand, recounting the last days leading up to the crime. Their testimonies painted a complex portrait of the defendant's life, a mix of normal adolescent struggles and moments of troubling behavior. Family members described a girl who, despite challenges, had shown glimpses of kindness and vulnerability. Yet, beneath that veneer, there were signs of distress that no one had fully understood or addressed. The defendant's own testimony was brief but telling. Her voice trembled as she recounted her version of events, insisting on her innocence and expressing confusion over how she had come to be at the center of such a devastating tragedy. Her words reflected a struggle to make sense of a reality that had spiraled far beyond her control. The courtroom watched, some with sympathy, others with skepticism, as she pleaded for understanding. Throughout the trial, the community's reaction was a mixture of sorrow and incredulity. Many grappled with the idea that someone so young could be held responsible for such a heinous act. Parents worried about the safety of their own children, while educators and counselors reflected on missed warning signs and the broader societal failures that might have contributed to this tragedy. The case sparked conversations about youth, accountability, and the complexities of justice in a world where innocence and guilt often blur. The victim's family, while devastated, sought to channel their grief into calls for justice. Their statements in court were heartfelt and raw, conveying the depth of their loss and the enduring impact of the crime. They spoke not only of sorrow, but of a desire to prevent similar tragedies, urging the community to come together in support of healing and prevention. As the sentencing phase unfolded, the defendant's tearful outburst, "This is unfair," resonated deeply. It was a cry that echoed the confusion and pain felt by many who struggled to understand how a life so young could be irrevocably altered. The courtroom was a microcosm of a community, wrestling with loss, justice, and the search for meaning in the aftermath of a tragedy that defied easy answers. The judge, presiding over the proceedings with a solemn demeanor, reminded all present of the gravity of their task. The sentencing would not only determine the fate of a teenager, but would also send a message about accountability and the rule of law. Lawyers prepared their closing arguments, weighing legal precedent against the human stories at the heart of the case. Outside the courthouse, the atmosphere was heavy with anticipation. Supporters of both the victim and the defendant gathered, their emotions raw and unfiltered. Conversations unfolded about what justice truly meant and how the community could move forward. The case had become more than a legal matter. It was a catalyst for reflection and dialogue about youth, crime, and the possibility of redemption. In the days leading up to the sentencing, reporters delved into the background of the case, uncovering details about the defendant's life and the events that led to the crime. The media coverage was intense, presenting a mosaic of perspectives that highlighted the complexity of the situation. Experts weighed in on the challenges of trying minors for serious offenses, while advocates called for a nuanced approach that balanced justice with compassion. The trial had revealed fractures not only in one young life, but also in the fabric of the community. It exposed the vulnerabilities of youth, the consequences of unmet needs, and the difficult questions society must confront when tragedy strikes so close to home. As the defendant faced the possibility of a harsh sentence, the community braced itself for the outcome and the long road toward healing that lay ahead. Within the courtroom, the final moments of the sentencing phase approached. The defendant's tearful plea, "This is unfair," remained a haunting refrain. It was a moment that captured the heart of a case steeped in pain and complexity. A reminder that behind every legal proceeding are human lives forever changed. The judge prepared to deliver a decision that would resonate far beyond the walls of the courtroom, shaping the lives of all involved and the community that watched closely. As the hearing continued, the focus narrowed to the central question: how should justice be served when the accused is a child accused of a grave crime? The trial had laid bare the difficult balance between punishment and mercy, between the demands of the law and the hopes for rehabilitation. The courtroom held its collective breath, awaiting the judgment that would define a new chapter in a story marked by sorrow, confusion, and the relentless pursuit of truth. The night of the crime unfolded with a chilling precision that investigators would later painstakingly reconstruct, piece by piece, through witness accounts, security footage, and phone records. It was a quiet evening in the neighborhood, the kind where families settled into their routines, unaware that within hours, their world and the community's would be irrevocably changed. The defendant's actions in the hours leading up to the tragedy were scrutinized closely. Around 6:30 p.m., neighbors reported seeing her leave her home, a small, modest house on the edge of town. She appeared calm but distant, carrying a backpack that would soon become a focal point of the investigation. The streets were mostly empty, save for the occasional passerby, making her movements all the more conspicuous in retrospect. Witnesses along the route described a figure moving deliberately, seemingly with purpose. At one point, a passerby noticed her pausing near a convenience store. glancing around nervously before entering briefly. Surveillance footage from the store captured her face, pale and tense, as she purchased a bottle of water and a snack. The cashier later testified that she seemed distracted, her eyes darting as if she were anxious about something unseen. By 7:15 p.m., the defendant was recorded on a neighbor's security camera approaching the victim's residence. The footage contradicted her later claims of innocence, showing her entering the house without hesitation. There was no sign of forced entry, suggesting that she either possessed a key or was let inside willingly, an important detail that began to unravel the narrative she would offer in court. Inside the victim's home, the atmosphere was starkly different. Family members recalled the last moments before everything changed. The victim was preparing dinner, her movements routine and unremarkable. At 7:30 p.m., she sent a brief text message to a friend, unaware that it would be one of her final communications. The message was simple, a casual check-in that held none of the ominous weight that would soon envelop the evening. Shortly after, the first signs of disturbance emerged. Neighbors reported hearing raised voices and the sound of furniture being moved around 7:45 p.m. Some described the noise as a heated argument, others as something more violent. But none anticipated the tragedy that was unfolding behind closed doors. A neighbor attempted to call the police, but hesitated, unsure if it was appropriate to intervene. At 7:52 p.m., a passerby noticed the defendant leaving the victim's house hurriedly, her demeanor markedly different from the calm she had exhibited hours earlier. She was clutching something in her hand, later identified as a small object tied to the crime. Her face was pale, and her steps were uneven, as if she were trying to distance herself from whatever had transpired inside. The rapid police response was triggered by a 911 call made at 7:55 p.m. The caller, a neighbor who had finally mustered the courage to report the disturbance, described hearing screams and pleading voices. Within minutes, officers arrived at the scene, their arrival marking the beginning of a grim investigation that would shed light on the harrowing events of that night. Inside the home, officers found evidence of a violent struggle. The victim lay in the living room, unresponsive, surrounded by signs of a sudden and brutal attack. The scene was chaotic. Upturned furniture, shattered glass, and personal belongings strewn across the floor. The smell of blood mingled with the faint scent of the dinner that had been abandoned mid-preparation. The defendant was located nearby, her hands trembling as she was taken into custody. Her initial statements were inconsistent, oscillating between confusion and denial. She claimed to have stumbled upon the scene after hearing a commotion, insisting that she was not involved. However, her story quickly unraveled under the weight of evidence. Forensic teams combed through the scene, collecting DNA samples, fingerprints, and ballistic evidence that would later contradict the defendant's account. Security logs from the neighborhood's surveillance system confirmed her presence inside the victim's home during the critical window of time. Cell phone records placed her at the scene, and messages recovered from her device raised further questions about her intentions. Neighbors who had witnessed parts of the evening were called upon to testify, their recollections painting a vivid timeline of the defendant's movements. One described seeing her speaking on the phone in a hushed, urgent tone minutes before arriving at the victim's house. Another recalled the nervous manner in which she left the scene, her eyes scanning the street as if searching for an escape. The timeline grew clearer as investigators pieced together the sequence of events. The defendant's arrival at the victim's home was no accident, and the evidence suggested a premeditated act rather than a spontaneous outburst. This conclusion was critical in shaping the prosecution's case, framing the crime as deliberate and calculated. Phone records revealed a series of messages sent and received in the hours leading up to the crime. Some were mundane exchanges with friends and family, but others hinted at emotional distress and conflict. The defendant had sent a cryptic text to a close acquaintance just before leaving her house. "I can't do this anymore." The message was interpreted as a possible indicator of her mindset, a signal of turmoil that had gone unnoticed or unaddressed. The victim's social circle was also examined, uncovering no known conflicts or motives that might explain the crime. Friends and family described the victim as kind-hearted and well-liked, leaving the question of why the defendant targeted her shrouded in mystery. This disparity between the victim's character and the violent act deepened the community's shock. The investigation extended beyond the immediate crime scene. Police searched the defendant's home and personal belongings, uncovering items that would become crucial pieces of evidence. A journal found in her room contained entries expressing anger, confusion, and a sense of isolation. Passages hinted at a brewing storm of emotions, but nothing that definitively pointed to the crime. In the days following the arrest, law enforcement officials held press conferences to update the public. They emphasized the thoroughness of their investigation and the strength of the evidence linking the defendant to the crime. The community was urged to remain patient as the judicial process unfolded, but the emotional impact of the night's events lingered. Family members of both the victim and the defendant grappled with the unfolding reality. The victim's relatives mourned the loss of a beloved daughter and friend, their grief compounded by the betrayal they felt in learning the accused was someone so young and known to the family. The defendant's family struggled with disbelief and sorrow, torn between love for their child and the gravity of the accusations. As the trial approached, the night of the crime stood as a stark reminder of how quickly life could change. What began as an ordinary evening ended in tragedy, leaving a community searching for answers and justice. The detailed timeline constructed by investigators would become a cornerstone of the prosecution's case, a narrative of events that challenged the defendant's claims and underscored the seriousness of the charges. The night's reconstruction not only illuminated the facts, but also revealed the human dimensions of the case. The fear, confusion, and irreversible consequences of a moment's actions. For the community, it was a somber chapter. A night that would be remembered not just for the crime itself, but for its profound impact on every life it touched. As the investigation unfolded, authorities began meticulously piecing together the evidence, uncovering discrepancies that would soon challenge the teenager's version of events and solidify her position as the prime suspect. What initially appeared as a chaotic night took on a clearer, more troubling narrative through the painstaking work of forensic experts and detectives determined to uncover the truth. From the very start, the defendant's statements raised red flags. Her claims of stumbling upon a violent scene, of being an innocent bystander shocked by the events, did not align with the physical evidence collected at the crime scene. Investigators noted inconsistencies in her recounting of the night, details that shifted with each retelling, and timelines that clashed with recorded data. These contradictions became a central focus as the case moved forward. Forensic teams worked tirelessly to analyze DNA samples, fingerprints, and ballistic reports, each piece contributing to an increasingly damning picture. The victim's blood was found not only at the scene, but also on items linked directly to the defendant. Her fingerprints were discovered on the murder weapon, a small, sharp object concealed in her belongings when she was apprehended. This contradicted her insistence that she had no involvement in the crime. Ballistic analysis further undermined her narrative. The trajectory of wounds and forensic reconstruction of the struggle indicated a close, personal altercation, suggesting intent and confrontation rather than a random or accidental incident. Experts testified that the nature of the injuries was consistent with a deliberate attack, and the weapon's placement within the scene aligned with the defendant's movement as captured by security footage. In addition, Digital forensics played a crucial role. Phone records and text messages from the defendant's device revealed alarming communications prior to the crime. Some messages conveyed emotional turmoil and frustration, but a subset hinted at premeditation. A message sent minutes before the incident read, "I'm done. No turning back." A phrase that prosecutors argued demonstrated forethought and intent. Investigators also scrutinized the defendant's social media activity. Searches conducted on her devices uncovered troubling queries related to violence and crime, including how to avoid detection and manipulate crime scenes. These findings painted a portrait of someone who had contemplated the consequences of her actions, countering claims of impulsivity or innocence. Security camera footage proved to be among the most compelling evidence. Contrary to her assertion of arriving at the crime scene only after the fact, video showed her entering the victim's home willingly and remaining inside during the critical window when the crime occurred. Logs from the neighborhood's surveillance network confirmed no other unauthorized entries, and the home's security system recorded no forced access, indicating that the defendant was the sole individual present at the time. Witness testimonies added layers of complexity. Neighbors reported hearing raised voices and disturbances consistent with a struggle, but none saw an intruder or anyone else entering or leaving the property. Some described the defendant's rapid departure from the scene as suspicious, noting her pale, disheveled appearance and hurried movements. These accounts undermined her claims of innocence and suggested a consciousness of guilt. Further examination of her movements before and after the incident revealed calculated behavior. Phone GPS data placed her near the victim's house well before the attack, contradicting her timeline. After the crime, she was seen discarding items linked to the offense, an act interpreted by investigators as an attempt to conceal evidence. The defense attempted to challenge the integrity of the forensic evidence, suggesting contamination or misinterpretation. However, expert witnesses for the prosecution stood firm, detailing the rigorous protocols followed during collection and analysis. The chain of custody for all critical items was documented meticulously, reinforcing the reliability of the findings. Autopsy reports provided additional clarity. The medical examiner's testimony described wounds consistent with a struggle, noting defensive injuries on the victim that indicated she had attempted to fend off her attacker. The nature of the injuries, combined with the timeline, directly implicated the defendant, who was the last known person with access to the victim's home. Investigators also uncovered evidence of staging in the aftermath of the crime. Items within the home were found deliberately displaced, and attempts were made to obscure the true sequence of events. The prosecution argued this pointed to a calculated effort by the defendant to mislead law enforcement and shift blame. Throughout the investigation, the defendant's psychological state was assessed. While some reports indicated emotional distress and possible mental health issues, forensic psychologists concluded that she was capable of understanding her actions and their consequences. This assessment weakened the defense's attempts to portray her as mentally incapacitated or unable to form intent. The mounting evidence created a narrative that was difficult to refute. The prosecution framed the case as one of premeditated violence masked by feigned innocence. The defense, meanwhile, grappled with reconciling the overwhelming physical proof with the defendant's claims, seeking to introduce doubt about her mental state and the circumstances leading to the crime. As the investigation concluded, law enforcement officials prepared a comprehensive dossier for the prosecution. The case was presented with a detailed timeline, forensic analyses, and eyewitness accounts, all interwoven to establish the defendant's presence, actions, and intent. This compilation would form the backbone of the trial, laying bare the inconsistencies in the defendant's story and highlighting the severity of the offense. The community followed the unfolding investigation closely, grappling with the revelations and the growing certainty of the defendant's involvement. The stark contrast between the teenage girl they once knew and the image painted by the evidence sparked intense debate about accountability, justice, and the factors that led to such a violent act. For the victim's family, the emerging evidence was both painful and affirming. It confirmed their fears and suspicions, underscoring the reality of their loss and the betrayal they felt. Their resolve to seek justice intensified as the investigation closed, preparing them for the forthcoming courtroom battles. In court, prosecutors laid out the evidence with precision, methodically dismantling the defense's narrative. The presentation was clinical yet compelling, supported by expert testimony and irrefutable forensic data. The jury listened intently as the story of that night was reconstructed, piece by piece, through the lens of science and eyewitness accounts. The defense sought to humanize the defendant, emphasizing her youth and emotional struggles. They argued that the evidence, while troubling, did not conclusively prove intent or premeditation. Instead, they portrayed the tragedy as a culmination of factors beyond her control, seeking leniency in the face of overwhelming odds. Despite these efforts, the weight of the investigation cast a long shadow over the defense's case. The meticulous gathering of evidence and the clarity it provided left little room for doubt. The trial was poised to delve deeper into the complexities of the defendant's background and motives. But the foundation had been firmly laid. The investigation's findings would become the cornerstone of the prosecution's argument, shaping the narrative of guilt and responsibility that would dominate the courtroom. It was a story of betrayal, loss, and the unyielding pursuit of truth through the relentless work of forensic science. A pursuit that would ultimately determine the fate of a young life forever altered by that fateful night. As the courtroom drama unfolded, attention turned to the teenager's background, seeking to understand the underlying forces that may have contributed to the tragic events. The defense and prosecution alike delved into her family dynamics, school life, and mental health history, attempting to paint a fuller picture of the young defendant beyond the cold facts of the case. Born into a working-class family, the teenager's early years were marked by a series of challenges that, while not uncommon, shaped her fragile emotional landscape. Interviews with relatives revealed a home environment strained by financial difficulties and intermittent parental conflict. Her mother, often overwhelmed by work and household responsibilities, struggled to provide the consistent support the girl needed, while her father's sporadic presence left gaps in guidance and supervision. School records and teacher testimonies depicted a student who had once shown promise, but gradually became withdrawn and disengaged. Teachers recalled a bright girl with a curious mind who, over time, began missing classes and submitting incomplete assignments. Her attendance became erratic, and her demeanor shifted from one of quiet enthusiasm to one marked by irritability and isolation. Counselors noted her reluctance to open up, a silence that masked deeper struggles. Friends described the defendant as someone who had become increasingly distant in the months leading up to the crime. Once sociable and lively, she had retreated into herself, often declining invitations and avoiding group activities. Peers recounted instances of bullying and exclusion, both subtle and overt, which may have exacerbated her sense of alienation. Yet, despite these challenges, there were moments when her vulnerability shone through, a fleeting smile, a kind gesture that suggested a yearning for connection. Psychological evaluations conducted during the pre-trial proceedings shed light on her mental health status. Clinical psychologists who assessed her noted symptoms consistent with depression and anxiety, conditions that had gone largely unaddressed. Reports indicated episodes of mood swings, bouts of anger, and periods of profound sadness. While not diagnosed with a severe psychiatric disorder, the evaluations underscored a fragile emotional state that, when combined with external pressures, created a volatile mix. Family members, in interviews and court testimonies, expressed regret over missed warning signs. Her mother recounted moments of concern when the girl would isolate herself for hours or exhibit sudden changes in behavior, but admitted that she felt ill-equipped to provide the necessary support. Relatives acknowledged a lack of communication within the household, attributing it to generational gaps and the stigma surrounding mental health issues. The defense seized upon these insights to argue that the defendant's actions were the product of accumulated emotional distress rather than calculated malice. They portrayed her as a troubled youth overwhelmed by circumstances beyond her control, emphasizing her need for rehabilitation and mental health intervention over punitive measures. Expert witnesses testified about adolescent brain development, highlighting the heightened impulsivity and susceptibility to external influences characteristic of her age. Conversely, the prosecution acknowledged the defendant's difficulties, but contended they did not excuse the severity of the crime. They argued that while mental health challenges might explain certain behaviors, the evidence demonstrated a level of planning and awareness incompatible with diminished responsibility. Prosecutors maintained that accountability was essential, regardless of age or circumstance, to uphold justice and protect the community. The courtroom also heard from school counselors and social workers who had interacted with the defendant. Their testimonies painted a picture of a young girl battling internal demons while navigating an environment that often failed to meet her needs. Attempts at intervention had been sporadic and limited, hampered by resource constraints and the defendant's reluctance to engage fully. In addition to emotional and psychological factors, the defense explored potential motives rooted in interpersonal conflicts. Reports of strained relationships with family members, instances of bullying at school, and feelings of rejection from peer groups were examined closely. Friends and acquaintances testified to moments of tension, jealousy, and frustration in the defendant's interactions, suggesting a backdrop of social turmoil that may have contributed to the breakdown leading to the crime. However, no definitive motive emerged from these accounts. The absence of a clear catalyst complicated the narrative, leaving a void that both sides sought to fill with their interpretations. The prosecution emphasized the lack of justification for violence, regardless of personal struggles, while the defense highlighted the complexity of adolescent emotions and the difficulty of articulating pain. The defendant's own statements offered glimpses into her mindset, but remained elusive in providing clear answers. She spoke of feeling overwhelmed by loneliness and confusion, expressing regret but stopping short of admitting full responsibility. Her words conveyed a young person grappling with the consequences of actions she did not fully understand, caught between remorse and denial. Throughout the proceedings, mental health experts underscored the importance of context in evaluating juvenile offenders. They argued that adolescence is a period marked by rapid development and vulnerability, where external stresses can precipitate drastic actions. Their testimony called for a justice approach that balanced accountability with compassion and the potential for rehabilitation. The community listened as these complexities were laid bare, sparking broader conversations about the challenges faced by youth in similar situations. Parents, educators, and mental health professionals engaged in dialogue about early intervention, support systems, and the societal responsibility to recognize and address emotional distress before it escalates. As the trial progressed, the defendant's background became a pivotal element in shaping perceptions. It humanized her, revealing a young girl caught in a storm of personal and social difficulties. Yet, It also raised difficult questions about the limits of empathy and the demands of justice when confronted with violent crime. The interplay between her troubled past and the crime itself became a focal point for both prosecution and defense. Each sought to frame her story in a way that supported their arguments, either as a cautionary tale of a youth pushed to the brink or as a case demanding accountability and consequences. In the end, the exploration of the defendant's life underscored the multifaceted nature of the case. It was not merely a legal proceeding, but a window into the complexities of adolescence, mental health, and the fragile line between victim and perpetrator. The courtroom bore witness to a narrative that extended beyond the immediate tragedy, touching on themes of neglect, pain, and the urgent need for understanding. The testimonies and expert analyses would shape the jury's deliberations, providing context that complicated the simple dichotomy of guilt and innocence. They invited reflection on the broader societal factors that contribute to youth violence and challenged preconceived notions about justice in cases involving minors. As the trial moved forward, the defendant's background remained a haunting presence, a reminder that beneath the surface of every crime lies a deeper story, one of human frailty, struggle, and the search for meaning in the aftermath of devastation. The day the teenager was formally charged and taken into custody marked a somber turning point in a case that had already shaken the community to its core. The courtroom was filled with a tense energy as prosecutors announced the official charges, setting in motion a legal process that would test the boundaries of justice and the complexities of trying a minor for a grave crime. The charges were clear and severe. First-degree murder, with the prosecution signaling their intent to seek the harshest possible penalties. The decision to pursue such charges against a 16-year-old ignited intense debate, both within the courtroom and across the wider public. Advocates for the victim's family demanded accountability, while others questioned the ethics of subjecting a juvenile to the full weight of the adult criminal justice system. Immediately following the arraignment, the teenager was taken into custody. Her expression a mixture of fear, confusion, and defiance. Her legal team moved swiftly to prepare for the upcoming pre-trial proceedings, filing motions aimed at challenging the prosecution's case and seeking to protect her rights. Bail hearings were scheduled, though it was widely anticipated that given the severity of the charges and the perceived flight risk, bail would be denied. The initial court appearances were marked by procedural formalities but underscored the gravity of the situation. The judge emphasized the seriousness of the charges and the need for a fair but firm approach. The defense requested psychological evaluations and access to the evidence, while the prosecution outlined their strategy to demonstrate premeditation and intent. Behind the scenes, attorneys from both sides engaged in intense legal maneuvering. The defense sought to highlight the defendant's age and mental health challenges, arguing for the case to be handled within the juvenile system or, at minimum, for consideration of mitigating circumstances. They filed motions to suppress certain pieces of evidence, questioning their admissibility and raising concerns about procedural errors during the investigation. The prosecution, however, remained resolute. They contended that the nature of the crime, particularly its brutality and the defendant's involvement, warranted adult charges. Prosecutors underscored the community's demand for justice and the necessity of sending a clear message that such actions would not be tolerated, regardless of the perpetrator's age. Media coverage intensified following the arraignment, with news outlets dissecting every development and speculating on the potential outcomes. Public opinion was sharply divided. Some voices called for compassion and rehabilitation, while others demanded a strong, punitive response. The case became a focal point for broader discussions about juvenile justice reform and the balance between punishment and rehabilitation. Bail hearings confirmed expectations. Given the severity of the charges and the defendant's age, the court denied bail, citing concerns about public safety and the risk of flight. The teenager was remanded to a juvenile detention facility, a stark transition from the life she had known to the isolating confines of incarceration. While detained, the defendant underwent a series of psychological evaluations designed to assess her mental state and competency to stand trial. These assessments would play a crucial role in shaping the defense's approach and informing the court's decisions on how to proceed. Psychologists and psychiatrists conducted interviews, reviewed her history, and administered tests to gauge her emotional and cognitive functioning. The results painted a nuanced picture. While the defendant exhibited signs of emotional distress and some mental health challenges, experts generally concluded that she was competent to participate in her defense and understand the proceedings. This determination diminished the likelihood of certain legal defenses centered on incapacity, but opened avenues for arguments related to diminished responsibility. Pre-trial motions became a battleground for legal arguments. The defense filed petitions to exclude certain evidence, including text messages and social media content, on grounds of privacy and potential prejudice. They also sought to have the case moved to juvenile court, arguing that the defendant's age and circumstances warranted a different legal framework. Prosecutors countered by emphasizing the evidence of premeditation and the severity of the offense, insisting that adult court was appropriate. They highlighted the community's interest in a trial that reflected the gravity of the crime and the need for accountability. The judge weighed these competing positions carefully, balancing legal standards with the unique factors of the case. During this period, interactions between the defendant and her legal team were marked by moments of tension and vulnerability. Court-appointed counsel worked to build trust, navigating the emotional complexities of representing a young person facing life-altering charges. The defendant's own statements fluctuated between remorse, confusion, and defiance, reflecting the tumultuous inner world that the trial would soon expose. The prosecution also prepared for trial by securing expert witnesses and gathering additional evidence. They coordinated with forensic specialists, psychologists, and law enforcement officials to construct a compelling narrative of guilt. Their case would hinge on demonstrating that the teenager possessed the requisite intent and awareness to be held fully responsible for the crime. In the community, reactions to the formal charges and the impending trial were mixed but intense. Victim advocacy groups rallied for justice, organizing vigils and public forums to honor the victim's memory and support the family. At the same time, juvenile justice advocates called for greater focus on rehabilitation and questioned the appropriateness of adult charges for minors. Schools and local organizations sought to address the broader impact of the case, initiating programs aimed at mental health awareness, conflict resolution, and support for at-risk youth. The tragedy had unveiled cracks in the social fabric, prompting conversations about prevention and the importance of early intervention. As the court dates approached, the media spotlight intensified, with reporters covering every legal maneuver and personal development. The defendant became a figure of national attention, a symbol of the complex intersection between youth, crime, and justice. Editorials debated the morality of sentencing minors as adults, while legal experts analyzed the potential consequences for the justice system. Inside the courtroom, preparations for the trial's opening statements were underway. Both prosecution and defense teams refined their narratives, aware that the stakes were extraordinarily high. The prosecution focused on the evidence of premeditation and harm, while the defense prioritized the defendant's age, mental health, and background as mitigators. The trial promised to be a contentious and emotionally charged affair. with the courtroom serving as the stage for a battle between contrasting visions of justice. The teenagers, fate, and the message sent to the community about accountability and compassion hung in the balance as the legal process moved inexorably forward. Throughout the pre-trial period, the defendant's family faced their own struggles. They grappled with the public scrutiny, the pain of separation, and the daunting prospect of a trial that would expose intimate details of their lives. Support networks were limited, and the emotional toll was palpable. The victim's family, meanwhile, prepared to confront the legal system anew, seeking closure and justice for their loss. Their presence at court proceedings was a constant reminder of the human cost behind the legal arguments, grounding the process in the reality of grief and loss. As the day of the trial drew near, the community braced itself for what promised to be a defining moment. The case had evolved from a shocking crime to a complex legal and social battle, one that would challenge notions of youth, responsibility, and justice in profound ways. The courtroom awaited the first words that would open the door to the truth behind a tragedy that had forever altered lives. The courtroom was charged with an electric tension as the trial officially commenced, drawing intense media scrutiny and a community eager for answers. Opening statements set the tone for the battle ahead, with both prosecution and defense staking out their positions in a narrative that would shape the lives of everyone involved. Prosecutors took the floor first, painting a stark and unflinching portrait of the crime. They described the defendant as a calculating individual who had planned and executed a violent act that shattered a family and traumatized a community. Their narrative was built on the evidence painstakingly gathered during the investigation. Security footage, forensic analyses, and witness testimonies that underscored the premeditated nature of the offense. The prosecution emphasized the defendant's awareness and intent, asserting that age did not diminish responsibility for such a grave act. The graphic details of the crime were recounted with clinical precision, intended to convey the severity and finality of the victim's loss. The lead prosecutor's voice was steady but impassioned as she addressed the jury, urging them to consider the impact on the victim's family and the broader community. This was not a momentary lapse, she insisted. It was a deliberate choice, one that demands justice. She outlined the timeline of the evening, highlighting discrepancies in the defendant's statements and the overwhelming evidence pointing to guilt. The prosecution's opening set a somber tone, underscoring the irreversible consequences of the defendant's actions. When the defense attorney rose, the mood shifted to a plea for understanding and compassion. He acknowledged the tragedy, but urged the jury to look beyond the facts and consider the defendant's youth, emotional turmoil, and background. The defense framed the case as one of a troubled teenager caught in a storm of mental health struggles and social pressures, arguing that her actions stemmed from a place of confusion rather than malevolence. He asked the jury to weigh the evidence in the context of her developmental stage and the challenges she faced, suggesting that the law's purpose should include rehabilitation alongside punishment. The defense attorney's voice was measured and empathetic as he painted a picture of a young person overwhelmed by circumstances beyond her control. He highlighted expert assessments indicating emotional distress and impulsivity, proposing that these factors mitigated her culpability. The defense sought to humanize the defendant, presenting her not as a monster, but as a youth in desperate need of help. "She is not beyond redemption," he implored the jury. "She deserves a chance to heal and rebuild." Both sides acknowledged the gravity of the charges, but diverged sharply on the interpretation of the evidence and the appropriate response. The prosecution's narrative emphasized justice and accountability, while the defense centered on mercy and understanding. This stark contrast set the stage for a trial that would delve deeply into complex legal, psychological, and moral questions. Witnesses were called to the stand, beginning with law enforcement officers who detailed the initial investigation. They testified about the collection of evidence, the discovery of forensic links between the defendant and the crime scene, and the analysis of digital communications that contradicted her claims. The officers' accounts reinforced the prosecution's portrayal of a calculated crime, lending credibility to their timeline and sequence of events. Forensic experts followed, explaining the significance of the physical evidence. The medical examiner described the victim's injuries with clinical detachment, emphasizing their severity and the likelihood that the attack was intentional and violent. Ballistics and DNA analysts detailed their findings, which linked the defendant directly to the weapon and the victim's blood. These testimonies were presented with clear visual aids, photographs, diagrams, and charts, designed to make the complex science accessible to the jury. The defense cross-examined these witnesses vigorously, seeking to sow doubt about the interpretation of the evidence. They questioned the chain of custody, potential contamination, and the possibility of alternative explanations. However, their challenges often met with firm rebuttals, as prosecution experts stood by the thoroughness and reliability of their work. Next, the defense called witnesses to paint a broader picture of the defendant's life and psychological state. Psychologists testified about adolescent brain development, highlighting tendencies toward impulsivity and poor decision-making. They discussed the defendant's history of emotional distress, anxiety, and depression, arguing these factors played a crucial role in her actions. The experts emphasized that while the crime was serious, the defendant's age and mental health issues warranted a more nuanced consideration. Teachers and counselors who had interacted with the defendant also took the stand. They described her as a student who had struggled but had shown potential, often battling internal conflicts that went unnoticed or unaddressed. Their testimonies underscored the missed opportunities for intervention and support, suggesting that the tragedy might have been preventable with earlier help. Family members provided emotional testimony, expressing both love and sorrow. They spoke candidly about the defendant's struggles, the family's challenges, and their hopes for a future that included healing. Their presence brought a human dimension to the proceedings, reminding the jury of the complexity of the defendant's situation. Throughout the trial, the emotional undercurrents were palpable. The victim's family attended each day, their grief visible but composed. Their statements, when given, were heartfelt and poignant, underscoring the devastating impact of the crime. They appealed for justice, not only as a means of closure, but as a safeguard against future tragedies. The courtroom atmosphere was a delicate balance of legal rigor and raw emotion. Jurors listened attentively, absorbing the conflicting narratives and complex evidence. The trial's pace was deliberate, allowing time for reflection and careful consideration. Both sides recognized the importance of every word and every piece of evidence in shaping the ultimate verdict. As opening statements gave way to witness testimonies and expert analyses, the trial revealed the multifaceted nature of the case. It was more than a straightforward criminal proceeding. It was an exploration of youth, culpability, mental health, and the societal factors that intersect in moments of tragedy. The courtroom became a stage where competing visions of justice clashed and converged. The prosecution's case was clear, a deliberate act deserving of full accountability. The defense responded with a plea for understanding and the recognition of mitigating circumstances. The jury was tasked with navigating this complex terrain, weighing evidence, testimony, and emotion to arrive at a verdict that would echo far beyond the courtroom walls. As the trial progressed, it became evident that the story was not just about guilt or innocence, but about the broader questions of how society deals with troubled youth who commit serious crimes. The proceedings challenged preconceived notions and pushed everyone involved to confront uncomfortable truths about responsibility, mercy, and the potential for redemption. The opening phase of the trial set the stage for a legal and emotional journey that would test the limits of empathy and justice. The courtroom awaited the unfolding of a narrative that would ultimately determine the fate of a young life and the meaning of accountability in a world where innocence and culpability often blur. The defense's case unfolded with a deliberate focus on the teenager's psychological state, seeking to introduce a narrative of diminished capacity that complicated the stark portrait painted by the prosecution. Expert witnesses took the stand, their testimonies offering a window into the defendant's mental and emotional world, challenging the notion that her actions were fully calculated and deliberate. Dr. Elaine Matthews, a clinical psychologist specializing in adolescent development, was the first to testify. She described the unique vulnerabilities of teenage brains, emphasizing that judgment, impulse control, and emotional regulation are still in formative stages well into late adolescence. Her detailed explanation of neurodevelopment served as a foundation for the defense's argument that the defendant's decision-making was impaired at the time of the crime. Dr. Matthews recounted her extensive evaluation of the defendant, which included interviews, psychological testing, and review of her history. She testified that the defendant exhibited symptoms consistent with depression and anxiety, as well as signs of emotional dysregulation. These factors, combined with environmental stressors, contributed to impaired judgment and a diminished ability to foresee the consequences of her actions. The psychologist emphasized that while the defendant was not psychotic or legally insane, her capacity to fully understand the ramifications of her behavior was compromised. She explained that adolescents often act impulsively, especially under emotional distress, and that this developmental reality needed to be carefully weighed in the courtroom. Cross-examination by the prosecution sought to challenge these conclusions, highlighting evidence of planning and awareness. They questioned Dr. Matthews about the defendant's communications before and after the crime, including messages that suggested a degree of premeditation. The prosecution argued that such behavior indicated a level of cognitive functioning inconsistent with the diminished capacity defense. Despite the rigorous questioning, Dr. Matthews maintained her position, acknowledging the defendant's capacity for planning, but asserting that emotional turmoil and developmental immaturity still significantly influenced her actions. She cautioned against equating awareness with full culpability, urging the jury to consider the nuanced interplay of factors shaping adolescent behavior. Following Dr. Matthews, the defense called Dr. Samuel Perez, a forensic psychiatrist with expertise in juvenile mental health. Dr. Perez expanded on the psychological assessment, discussing how the defendant's history of trauma and familial instability further undermined her ability to make rational decisions under stress. He detailed the defendant's exposure to adverse childhood experiences, including neglect and emotional conflict, and how these experiences increase vulnerability to mental health disorders and maladaptive coping mechanisms. Dr. Perez explained that such backgrounds often lead to heightened impulsivity and difficulty managing intense emotions, which could contribute to tragic outcomes. The psychiatrist also addressed the concept of emerging adulthood, a developmental phase characterized by ongoing identity formation and susceptibility to environmental influences. He argued that the defendant's age placed her squarely within this phase, necessitating a justice approach that balanced accountability with recognition of her developmental status. The prosecution's cross-examination sought to undermine Dr. Perez's testimony by pointing to the defendant's actions that suggested forethought. including attempts to conceal evidence and inconsistent statements to law enforcement. They argued that these behaviors demonstrated a clear awareness of wrongdoing, challenging the notion of diminished responsibility. Dr. Perez conceded that the defendant's actions showed some awareness, but reiterated that emotional dysregulation and developmental immaturity complicated her ability to make fully rational choices. He emphasized that understanding these factors was crucial to delivering a fair verdict. In addition to psychological experts, the defense presented testimony from school counselors and social workers who had interacted with the defendant before the crime. Their accounts highlighted her struggles with mood swings, social isolation, and intermittent compliance with support services. They described a young person grappling with internal conflicts and external pressures, often withdrawing rather than seeking help. These witnesses testified to missed opportunities for intervention, suggesting that with appropriate support, the defendant might have avoided the downward spiral that culminated in tragedy. Their stories reinforced the defense's portrayal of a vulnerable adolescent in need of guidance and treatment, rather than harsh punishment. The defense also called family members to the stand, who spoke candidly about the defendant's emotional struggles and the family's challenges in providing consistent support. They shared anecdotes of her mood fluctuations, moments of despair, and attempts to reach out for help, painting a picture of a young life marked by hardship and unmet needs. The cumulative effect of these testimonies was to humanize the defendant and introduce reasonable doubt about her full criminal responsibility. The defense argued that while the crime was undeniably serious, the defendant's impaired capacity warranted consideration of alternative sentencing focused on rehabilitation. Prosecutors, however, remained steadfast in their position that the evidence of planning and deliberate action outweighed the psychological mitigating factors. They argued that recognizing emotional challenges did not absolve the defendant of accountability, especially given the severity of the offense. Throughout the defense's presentation, the courtroom atmosphere was charged with emotion and complexity. Jurors were confronted with conflicting narratives, one of a deliberate perpetrator and another of a troubled adolescent overwhelmed by forces beyond her control. The defense's strategy underscored the evolving understanding of juvenile justice, highlighting scientific insights into brain development and the importance of tailoring legal responses to the unique circumstances of young offenders. It challenged the traditional binary of guilt and innocence, inviting the jury to consider a spectrum of culpability. As the defense rested, the stage was set for the final phases of the trial. Jury deliberation and the looming question of how justice would be served in a case that defied easy answers. The courtroom remained a crucible where law, psychology, and human frailty intersected, and where the fate of a young life hung in the balance. The jury entered the deliberation room amid a heavy silence, the weight of the case pressing down on each member as they faced the formidable task ahead. Hours stretched into days as they meticulously reviewed the evidence, testimony, and arguments presented throughout the trial. The complexity of the case, coupled with the defendant's youth and the gravity of the crime, made their decision anything but straightforward. At the heart of their discussions was the question of intent and culpability. Had the defendant acted with full awareness, or had her psychological state diminished her responsibility? Jurors debated the conflicting expert testimonies. The prosecution's portrayal of a deliberate, calculating act versus the defense's argument for diminished capacity rooted in adolescent brain development and emotional turmoil. Some jurors grappled with the stark facts of the crime, the brutality, the evidence of planning, the attempts to conceal wrongdoing, finding it difficult to reconcile such actions with any claim of diminished responsibility. They emphasized the victim's suffering and the community's need for justice, advocating for a verdict that reflected the severity of the offense. Others on the panel were moved by the defense's portrayal of the defendant as a troubled teenager, vulnerable and overwhelmed. They highlighted the psychological assessments and the expert insights into adolescent development, arguing that these factors warranted leniency and a recognition of mitigating circumstances. For them, the defendant was not a hardened criminal, but a youth whose actions stemmed from a complex interplay of emotional and developmental challenges. As deliberations continued, the jurors examined the timeline of events, dissecting phone records, security footage, and forensic evidence. They revisited witness statements, weighing credibility and consistency. The conflicting narratives presented in court fueled intense discussions, with jurors challenging each other's interpretations and assumptions. The defendant's tearful declaration, "This is unfair," echoed in their minds, a haunting reminder of the human element behind the legal proceedings. Some jurors empathized with her plight, recognizing the confusion and fear conveyed in those words. Others viewed it as a desperate plea from someone unwilling to accept responsibility. Throughout the deliberations, the jury wrestled with the moral and legal implications of their decision. The possibility of sentencing a minor to death row loomed large, provoking debates about the ethics of such punishment for a teenager. Jurors considered the broader societal ramifications, questioning how justice could balance accountability with compassion. The intensity of the discussions was evident in the jurors' interactions. Emotions ran high, with moments of frustration, doubt, and resolve. They sought clarity amid the complexity, striving to reach a unanimous verdict that would honor both the law and their conscience. After exhaustive deliberations, the jury reached a decision that surprised some and satisfied others. They returned to the courtroom with a unanimous verdict: guilty on all counts, including first-degree murder, and with a recommendation for the death penalty. The verdict sent a shockwave through the courtroom, eliciting a mixture of disbelief, sorrow, and grim acceptance. The judge solemnly acknowledged the verdict, recognizing the gravity of the jury's decision and the weight of the consequences it carried. The teenager's earlier protest, "This is unfair," resonated anew, underscoring the profound tensions between justice, youth, and mercy that had permeated the trial. In the aftermath of the verdict, jurors spoke to reporters, revealing the careful deliberation behind their decision. They emphasized that despite their empathy for the defendant's circumstances, the evidence of premeditation and the seriousness of the crime compelled them to deliver the harshest sentence. Their reasoning reflected a commitment to upholding the law while grappling with the moral complexities inherent in sentencing a minor. The courtroom reacted with a mix of emotions. The victim's family expressed a measure of relief that justice had been served, though their grief remained palpable. Community members voiced varied reactions, some supporting the verdict as necessary for public safety, others mourning the loss of a young life to the criminal justice system. Legal experts weighed in on the case's implications, noting the rarity of death penalty sentences for juveniles and the potential for appeals and legal challenges. The verdict sparked renewed debates about juvenile justice, mental health considerations, and the appropriateness of capital punishment for minors. Within the defendant's family, the verdict was met with shock and despair. Their expressions conveyed a mixture of disbelief and sorrow as they grappled with the reality of a death sentence for their child. Supporters and advocates for juvenile justice rallied around them, calling for compassion and reconsideration. The community stood at a crossroads, confronted with the harsh realities of violent crime committed by youth and the complexities of responding through the legal system. The case became a catalyst for discussions about prevention, mental health resources, and the need to balance justice with humanity. As the formal sentencing hearing approached, anticipation grew. The courtroom prepared to hear victim impact statements and legal arguments that would shape the final judgment. The trial had laid bare the profound challenges of administering justice in a case where innocence and guilt, youth and accountability, mercy and punishment converged in a tragic and unforgettable way. The jury's decision marked not an end, but a new chapter, a moment of reckoning for all involved, and a somber reflection on the limits and possibilities of justice in a world fraught with complexity and pain. The courtroom was hushed as the sentencing hearing commenced, a solemn atmosphere underscoring the gravity of the moment. The judge, presiding with measured authority, prepared to deliver a sentence that would resonate deeply within the community and irrevocably alter the trajectory of a young life. The jury's verdict, guilty on all counts with a recommendation for the death penalty, had set the stage for a hearing fraught with emotion, reflection, and the unyielding pursuit of justice. Victim impact statements opened the proceedings, providing a heartbreaking glimpse into the enduring damage wrought by the crime. Family members spoke with raw vulnerability, their voices trembling as they recounted the profound loss and shattered dreams left in the wake of the tragedy. Each statement was a testament to love and grief intertwined, a plea for justice that spoke to the human cost beyond the legal abstractions. The victim's mother's testimony was particularly poignant. She described the void left by her daughter's absence, the silence in a home once filled with laughter and warmth. Her words conveyed not only sorrow, but a resolute demand that the court impose a sentence reflective of the crime's severity. "No punishment can bring her back," she said, "but justice must be served to honor her memory." Other family members echoed these sentiments, sharing stories of the victim's kindness, potential, and the life that had been cruelly cut short. Their statements underscored the ripple effects of the crime, how it touched not just immediate relatives, but friends, neighbors, and the wider community. The courtroom absorbed their grief, a collective mourning that lent weight to the proceedings. The defendant's family also spoke, their voices a mixture of remorse and anguish. They expressed sorrow for the pain caused and acknowledged the seriousness of the crime while pleading for mercy. Their statements highlighted the defendant's youth, mental health struggles, and the hope for rehabilitation rather than retribution. These words added complexity to the hearing, reminding all present of the human dimensions on both sides. Legal arguments followed the victim impact statements. The prosecution urged the court to uphold the jury's recommendation, emphasizing the deliberate and heinous nature of the crime. They argued that the death penalty was appropriate given the evidence of premeditation and the lasting harm inflicted. The prosecution framed the sentence as a necessary measure to uphold justice and deter future violence. The defense countered with appeals for leniency, stressing the defendant's age, psychological vulnerabilities, and potential for rehabilitation. They argued that a sentence of life imprisonment with the possibility of parole would better serve the interests of justice and society. The defense cautioned against the irreversible nature of the death penalty, especially for a juvenile, urging the court to consider mercy and the evolving standards of juvenile sentencing. The judge listened intently to both sides, weighing the emotional testimonies and legal arguments with careful deliberation. In his sentencing remarks, he acknowledged the profound loss suffered by the victim's family and the community's demand for justice. He recognized the defendant's youth and the complex factors that had contributed to the crime, but emphasized the need to uphold the rule of law. Ultimately, the judge imposed consecutive life sentences totaling 200 years, with the possibility of parole after 30 years. The decision balanced the severity of the offense with the defendant's age and mental health considerations, reflecting a nuanced approach to justice. The sentence conveyed the court's recognition of both accountability and the potential for rehabilitation. The defendant's emotional response was subdued but visible. She appeared detached, her gaze distant as the sentence was pronounced. The courtroom remained silent, the weight of the moment settling over all present. The sentence marked a conclusion to the trial phase, but the beginning of a long and complex journey ahead for everyone involved. Following the hearing, discussions about mental health and the warning signs of potential violence gained traction within the community. Local organizations and schools initiated programs aimed at early intervention, emotional support, and conflict resolution. The tragedy served as a catalyst for broader efforts to address the underlying issues that can lead to youth violence. The victim's family, while grappling with their loss, channeled their grief into advocacy. They established a foundation in memory of their loved one, focusing on educational support and mental health initiatives for young people. Their work aimed to prevent similar tragedies and provide resources for families facing emotional challenges. The case became a cautionary tale about the complexities of familial relationships, mental health, and the potential for violence within seemingly ordinary lives. It sparked ongoing conversations about how society can better identify and address the needs of vulnerable youth before circumstances escalate. As time passed, the community sought to honor the memories of the victim, emphasizing love, resilience, and the importance of healing. Memorials and events celebrated her life, reminding all of the enduring impact of loss and the collective responsibility to foster safety and compassion. The defendant's journey continued within the correctional system, where opportunities for psychological treatment and education were provided. Her case remained a subject of legal scrutiny and public debate, reflecting the broader challenges of balancing justice, punishment, and rehabilitation for juvenile offenders. The sentencing hearing, while a legal milestone, underscored the profound human dimensions of crime and punishment. It revealed the intersections of loss, accountability, mercy, and hope that define the pursuit of justice in a complex and often painful world. In the aftermath of the sentencing, the community grappled with a mix of emotions: grief, relief, anger, and reflection. The legal process had reached a conclusion, but the echoes of the tragedy continued to reverberate through families, neighborhoods, and local institutions. The appeals process was set in motion almost immediately, as defense attorneys prepared to challenge the verdict and sentence, citing concerns over the death penalty's application to a minor and raising questions about the fairness of the trial. The appeals opened a new chapter in the saga, one marked by legal complexities and broader societal debates. Advocates for juvenile justice rallied against the imposition of the death penalty on a 16-year-old, arguing that scientific research on adolescent brain development and international human rights standards called for more humane treatment. They highlighted evolving legal precedents that increasingly recognize the limitations of holding minors to the same standards as adults in capital cases. Meanwhile, victim advocacy groups maintained their calls for justice, emphasizing the need to honor the victim's memory and protect communities from violent crime. The tension between these perspectives underscored the ongoing challenges in balancing public safety, accountability, and compassion within the criminal justice system. Within the community, conversations deepened around mental health support and prevention. Schools implemented programs aimed at identifying at-risk youth, promoting emotional literacy, and providing accessible counseling services. Local government and nonprofit organizations collaborated to expand resources for families struggling with emotional and behavioral issues. These initiatives reflected a collective commitment to addressing root causes and preventing similar tragedies. The defendant's case became emblematic of broader issues in juvenile justice reform. Legal scholars and policymakers debated the ethics and efficacy of harsh sentencing for minors, considering alternatives that emphasized rehabilitation and reintegration. The case spurred legislative proposals aimed at restricting the use of capital punishment for juveniles and improving mental health services within the justice system. As appeals progressed through the courts, the defendant remained incarcerated, participating in educational and therapeutic programs designed to support her rehabilitation. Her legal team worked tirelessly to present new evidence and arguments, seeking to overturn the death sentence and secure a more appropriate disposition given her age and psychological profile. The victim's family continued their advocacy, using their platform to raise awareness about the consequences of youth violence and the importance of community support. They navigated the complex emotions of pursuing justice while promoting healing, embodying resilience in the face of unimaginable loss. Their foundation grew, providing scholarships, counseling, and outreach programs that reached thousands of young people and families. Public discourse around the case evolved, reflecting shifting attitudes toward juvenile justice. Media coverage highlighted the nuances of the legal battle and the human stories behind it, fostering greater empathy and understanding. Educational forums and community dialogues engaged diverse voices, encouraging reflection on how society can better support vulnerable youth and respond to violent crime. The case also prompted internal reviews within law enforcement and social services, leading to improved protocols for identifying warning signs and intervening before crises escalate. Training programs for educators, counselors, and first responders incorporated lessons learned, aiming to create a more responsive and compassionate safety net. Years passed, and the community sought to move forward while honoring the past. Memorials and annual events commemorated the victim's life, serving as reminders of the enduring impact of violence and the collective responsibility to nurture hope and resilience. Stories of healing and transformation emerged, offering glimmers of light amid the shadows. The defendant's story remained a poignant element of this ongoing narrative, a reminder of the fragile boundary between childhood and adulthood, innocence and culpability. Her journey through the justice system highlighted the complexities of punishment and redemption, challenging society to confront uncomfortable truths about youth, trauma, and accountability. As the appeals process continued, the case influenced policy discussions at the state and national levels. Legislators considered reforms that balanced public safety with the developmental realities of adolescence. Mental health advocates pushed for expanded resources and alternatives to incarceration. The dialogue underscored a growing recognition that justice must be both firm and compassionate. Ultimately, the case became more than a legal battle. It evolved into a catalyst for change. It sparked a reevaluation of how communities and systems respond to youth in crisis, emphasizing prevention, support, and the potential for growth. The tragedy, while deeply sorrowful, inspired a commitment to building a safer, more empathetic society. Through the pain and complexity, the community sought to heal, honoring the victim's memory by striving to prevent future loss. The story remained a powerful testament to the challenges of justice in a world where human frailty and resilience coexist. It served as a call to action, to listen, to understand, and to act with both courage and compassion.